My name is Amelia Hart. I'm 32 years old, born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, and if you had told me just a few years ago that my life would unravel the way it did, I wouldn't have believed you. I used to think betrayal came from enemies, strangers, people lurking on the outside trying to tear down what you built. But I've learned the most painful kind comes from the ones you trust the most, the ones you love. I grew up in a family that looked perfect from the outside. My parents, John and Beverly Hart, were well respected in our community. My dad owned a small construction business, and my mom worked at the local library. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Church on Sundays, family barbecues on the weekends, and matching Christmas pajamas every December. You get the picture. We were that kind of family. Or at least, we looked like it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe that protecting your child sometimes means standing up to your own family. The truth is, my sister Rachel was always the favorite. If she wanted something, she got it. When she wanted to quit piano, my parents told her to follow her passion. When I wanted to join a creative writing club, they told me to focus on real goals. When Rachel failed a class, they hired a tutor. When I got straight A's, they barely looked up from their phones. I learned early on to keep my head down and push forward, to rely on myself and no one else. And eventually, I left home to build my own life, one where I didn't need their approval. Things weren't perfect, but I was making it. I had a stable job at a medical clinic, a modest apartment, and, most importantly, I had my daughter, Lila. She was my entire world. Lila was born when I was 26, and though her father didn't stick around, I never saw her as a mistake. She was the brightest part of my life, a clever, curious, wide-eyed girl who asked too many questions and loved too fiercely. Every decision I made was for her. When Lila turned 5, I had to undergo surgery. It wasn't optional. I'd had issues with my gallbladder for months, and the doctors warned that waiting longer could put me in serious danger. The surgery was quick, but the recovery wasn't. I couldn't lift Lila, couldn't drive her to school, couldn't make her meals, and I didn't have extended family on her father's side to turn to. So, against my instincts, I asked my parents for help. It was supposed to be temporary, just a couple of weeks. I trusted them. At first, they agreed, almost too quickly. Of course, my mother had said on the phone, her voice unusually cheerful. Family helps family. She came to pick Lila up that evening, hugging her tightly in front of me, like she was the world's most loving grandma. I tried not to let my uneasiness show, chalking it up to surgery nerves. I reminded myself that no matter our issues, these were her grandparents. She would be safe. I was wrong. Less than a week into my recovery, I tried to call my parents. No answer. I figured they were busy. I tried again later. Nothing. Then again. The silence began to suffocate me. I texted my mom. "How's Lila?" No reply. I waited, growing restless. I called my sister Rachel. She answered on the second ring, sounding like she was sipping a smoothie on a beach somewhere. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked cautiously. "Oh, you didn't know," she said, clearly surprised. "Mom and Dad flew out with us to Hawaii last night. I thought they told you." I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, unable to form words. "Hawaii?" I blinked, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. "What do you mean? They flew out with you. Where's Lila?" There was a pause, just a second, but long enough to twist my stomach into a knot. "They said they had to drop her off with someone, some family service thing? I thought you knew." That's when the room began to spin. My heart slammed against my chest, and a cold, sickening dread took hold of me. I hung up without saying goodbye. My fingers trembled as I dialed every number I could think of. Police, Child Protective Services, local hospitals. I learned the awful truth 2 hours later. My parents had voluntarily surrendered custody of Lila to CPS. They told the agency they were unable to care for her, and that I was temporarily incapacitated with no backup plan. They didn't list emergency contacts. They didn't call me, and they didn't wait for my permission. They handed my daughter over to the system so they could fly to Hawaii with Rachel and her twin boys. I remember screaming, not out of rage, but something deeper, more guttural. Grief. I felt like a part of me had been ripped out and thrown away like garbage. How could they do that? How could my own parents turn their backs on my daughter? On me? It didn't end there. The social worker assigned to Lila's case was compassionate, but the system had its rules. Because I was recovering from surgery and technically unable to provide physical care, Lila would remain in temporary foster care until an evaluation could be completed. I wasn't even allowed to visit her right away. I had to go through a process: background checks, medical clearances, supervised visits, all while my body was still healing and my heart was barely intact. And where were my parents during all this? Drinking cocktails by the ocean. I saw the photos Rachel posted on Instagram. My mom smiling in a flower crown. My dad teaching the boys how to surf. Not a mention of Lila. Not a word about me. They came back 2 weeks later, tanned and carefree. They didn't even apologize. My mom said, "We did what we had to do. You weren't well, and we didn't want to cancel the trip." Cancel the trip? I wanted to scream. But I didn't. Not then. I bit my tongue, nodded, and played nice. Because I knew something they didn't. Vengeance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient, calculated. It waits for the right moment to strike, not just to hurt, but to expose. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I stopped seeing them as my parents and started seeing them for what they were. People who abandoned my child for a vacation. People who didn't deserve to be in our lives. What they didn't know was that I was already planning something they'd never expect. They thought they could treat me like an afterthought forever. But this time, they'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. And I was going to make sure they paid for it. Not with fists. Not with screaming matches. But with something far worse. The truth. When I finally stood on my own 2 feet again, both physically and emotionally, the world no longer looked the same. The pain of betrayal still burned through me like a fresh wound, but beneath that pain, something else had taken root. Purpose. Every breath I took was no longer just about surviving. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen and building a life for my daughter where betrayal like this would never touch her again. I knew I couldn't erase what happened, but I could make sure the people responsible never forgot what they did. The first step was getting Lila back. I dove headfirst into the process CPS had laid out for me. I didn't miss a single appointment, didn't complain, didn't let them see how broken I really was. I went to the doctor and got medical clearance, submitted every background check, passed every home inspection. I spent hours preparing the apartment to make it look warmer, safer, more welcoming. I even framed pictures of Lila, just so the walls would show how much she meant to me. Every inch of my body ached during those days. But I pushed through it like a soldier marching through enemy territory, one determined foot after another. When I finally saw her again during our first supervised visit, Lila ran into my arms without hesitation, sobbing into my shoulder as if she'd been holding her breath this entire time. She asked why Grandma and Grandpa had left her. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth. Not yet. So I just held her close and whispered, "I'm here now, and I'm never leaving you again." What angered me most was how easily my parents shrugged it all off. When they returned from Hawaii, they didn't stop by to see how I was doing. They didn't ask about Lila or try to fix anything. They simply went back to their routines like none of it mattered. The betrayal wasn't just the abandonment. It was their apathy. Their absence from Lila's life had been a choice, not a mistake, and I couldn't let it go unpunished. Rachel, on the other hand, didn't feel the same guiltless comfort. She tried to reach out. "I didn't know they were going to do that," she texted one afternoon. "I thought you had a backup plan." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Not because I believed her. I didn't. But because I knew she was only texting out of fear. People like Rachel don't like messes they can't control. They fear exposure. That fear was something I could use. Once I had full custody of Lila reinstated, something that took nearly a month, I sat down and began to gather every piece of evidence I could find. Text messages, emails, voicemails, photos, witnesses. I requested official records from CPS and asked for copies of every statement my parents had given. What I found chilled me to my core. My mother had told the caseworker that I was likely unfit long-term and emotionally unstable. She cited past depressive episodes, exaggerating the mild postpartum struggles I'd overcome years ago without any medical intervention. My father claimed I had no support system, that I had always relied on them for childcare. A blatant lie, considering I'd raised Lila on my own since birth. They hadn't just abandoned my daughter. They had tried to paint me as a negligent mother. What struck me most was the lengths they went to in order to justify their actions. They didn't just make the case that they couldn't care for Lila. They made it seem like I didn't deserve to. That was the moment the line was drawn. This wasn't about a misjudgment or a bad call in a moment of panic. This was calculated. I started talking to an attorney, not to sue, not yet, but to understand my rights. I wasn't interested in revenge through the courts. I wanted to take control in a way that mattered more deeply. My parents had a spotless reputation in our community. My father had recently been nominated for a local leadership award. My mother ran charity events and had a column in the community newsletter. They were seen as pillars of compassion and decency. I couldn't unlive what they had done, but I could dismantle the illusion they had built around themselves. And I could start by showing them what it felt like to be publicly exposed. Quietly, I drafted a letter. Not to them, but to the editor of the local newspaper. I didn't name names, not at first. I simply told a story. One of a woman recovering from surgery, whose child was surrendered to foster care by trusted family members so they could enjoy a luxury vacation. I spoke of betrayal, abandonment, and the silent suffering that often hides behind closed doors. The editor published it as an anonymous personal essay. Within days, it went viral locally. Neighbors started whispering. Congregants at their church began asking questions. People pieced together the timeline. My parents' perfect image began to fracture. They called me furious. "How dare you shame us like this?" My mother snapped over the phone. "How dare you abandon my daughter?" I said, my voice cold and steady. "You know we did what was best at the time." "No," I said. "You did what was best for you." They hung up, and I didn't hear from them again. But the consequences had only begun. My father's nomination was quietly withdrawn. My mother lost her weekly column. Donations to her charity events slowed. She was removed from the planning committee of a local fundraiser she'd chaired for years. The social world they'd built began to collapse around them, not because I asked for revenge, but because I told the truth. And people listened. I expected that to be enough. But something in me still felt raw. My daughter had been taken from me. For days, she cried in her sleep. She started wetting the bed again. She was afraid of being left anywhere, even with me. The damage they'd caused wasn't just emotional, it was developmental, and that haunted me more than anything. One evening, I sat Lila down and told her the truth, gently, but clearly. "Grandma and Grandpa made a bad choice," I said. "They chose something fun instead of staying to help us, and that wasn't okay." She looked up at me with her big brown eyes and said, "They didn't love me enough?" My throat tightened. "They didn't love you the way they should have," I whispered. "But that's not your fault. You are lovable. You are important. And you deserve people who never leave." She nodded slowly, her small fingers curling into mine. That moment became a turning point, not just for her, but for me. I started attending counseling sessions with Lila. I found a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma and attachment issues. We worked hard to rebuild the sense of safety she had lost. And in those sessions, I began healing too. I stopped asking myself why they did it, and started asking what kind of life I wanted going forward, who I wanted in it, and who I didn't. Rachel tried again to reach out, apologizing, explaining, begging me to understand. I responded with a single sentence: "You chose silence when your voice could have protected Lila." And then I blocked her. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about boundaries, about reclaiming power, about standing up for the little girl who needed someone to fight for her. And I wasn't done yet. The next phase of my plan required precision. I had one more card to play, one that would make my parents face the consequences not just socially, but professionally. I knew that if I truly wanted to sever the control my parents once held over my life, I had to do more than just speak out. Their influence ran deep, not just in the community, but in the systems they were involved in. My father had quietly become a silent partner in multiple small businesses in San Antonio, one of which employed vulnerable youth trying to get back on their feet after incarceration or addiction. On the surface, it looked like charity. In reality, I learned, it was an image management campaign, carefully curated to overshadow his less admirable qualities. He wasn't cruel to those kids, but he wasn't as benevolent as people believed either. They worked long hours for minimal pay. No benefits, no mentorship, just tasks, rules, and the unspoken threat that they were replaceable. That discovery didn't come from nowhere. A former patient from the clinic I worked at, a young man named Miguel, reached out after reading my anonymous article. He recognized my story and told me he once worked at one of my father's youth initiative workshops. He said the conditions were exhausting, the treatment dismissive, and any concern he raised was swept under the rug. "Your dad doesn't yell," Miguel said, "but he has this way of making you feel like nothing you say matters." That hit too close to home. It was exactly how I'd felt growing up. I asked Miguel if he'd be willing to write a statement, not for legal use, but for a different kind of exposure. He agreed. He wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, I collected stories from several former employees, most of whom were hesitant at first. But when I showed them what I'd already shared, many opened up. They wanted their truth heard too. They just didn't know how to begin. That's when I decided to take it one step further. I created a digital platform, a website dedicated to sharing real stories of silent harm committed under the guise of respectability. I called it the Unseen Wounds Project. At first, it was just mine and Miguel's stories, but slowly, others came forward. Stories of neglect, emotional abuse, gaslighting from people who were admired publicly but manipulative behind closed doors. It wasn't just about my parents anymore. It was about something bigger, and it resonated. The site began gaining traction. Local advocacy groups reached out. A journalist from Austin contacted me, wanting to interview people connected to the stories. I kept my name anonymous for the time being, but it wasn't hard for anyone paying attention to connect the dots. My parents certainly did. One afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a folded letter in my father's handwriting. It wasn't an apology. It was a warning. "You've made your point. We suggest you stop before more damage is done. To your daughter, to your future. You don't want a war." I read it once, then again, and then I laughed. Not out of amusement, but disbelief. The man who'd left my child with strangers and flown off to paradise was warning me about damage, as if he hadn't already burned the bridge between us to ash. I called my lawyer. Not to press charges, but to start the paperwork that would formally sever any legal guardianship connections my parents had ever claimed with Lila. I wanted it documented. They were not her emergency contacts, not her backup guardians, not her anything. I wanted to make it irreversible. The day I filed those papers, something inside me loosened. A weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying began to lift. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their harm. I was preventing it. But peace didn't last long. A week later, I picked Lila up from school like usual. She was quiet that day, not her usual bubbly self. I figured she was tired, but when we got home, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her backpack. "This was in my cubby," she said, voice soft. It was a card, a pastel pink one with cartoon flowers on the front. Inside, in my mother's cursive handwriting, were the words, "Grandma and Grandpa still love you. We hope you remember that." No signature, no return address, just that single message, like a claw reaching out from the past, trying to reclaim her. My body went rigid. My first instinct was panic. How did they get access to her school? Had they been there? Watching? Lurking? I called the school immediately, demanded a meeting. The principal assured me no unauthorized visitors had entered the premises, and the school's security footage showed no sign of my parents. It was likely the card had been dropped off in the main office under the guise of being from another family member. Still, the damage was done. Lila was confused again. "Why can't I see them? Did I do something bad?" That night, I sat on the floor of her bedroom while she slept, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. wondering if I'd ever be able to shield her completely. I couldn't control what my parents did, only how I responded. So, I made a decision. The next morning, I went public. No more anonymity, no more secrets. I posted my full story on the Unseen Wounds Project, including my name, my daughter's name, and every detail I had previously withheld. I included screenshots, CPS reports, the handwritten letter, and the card Lila had received. I told the story in one uninterrupted stream of truth, raw, unfiltered, and real. The response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from women, men, teachers, nurses, even therapists who had seen too many families torn apart by manipulation disguised as concern. Some people knew my parents. Some had always suspected there was more to their perfect image. A few didn't believe me. That was expected. But most did. The tide was turning. Rachel called again. This time she left a voicemail. Her voice cracked halfway through. "I don't know what's left to say. I'm sorry, Amelia. I really am. I didn't think it would go this far. But it had gone that far. And no one stopped it. Not her. Not anyone." Lila and I began a new routine. Therapy sessions became part of our weekly rhythm. Mornings were filled with cartoons and cereal. Evenings with books and cuddles. We talked more now. About trust. About fear. About what it meant to keep promises. I saw her confidence returning, slowly but steadily. And somewhere in that journey, mine returned too. One day, as we walked through the park near our apartment, she reached up and took my hand. "Mommy," she said, "do we need anyone else?" I paused, smiled down at her. "We need people who choose us. Every day. Not just when it's easy." She nodded, her little fingers squeezing mine tighter. In that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just a turning point in my fight against my parents. It was a turning point in my story. As a mother, as a woman, as someone who once let silence fill too many spaces. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was reclaiming. The weeks that followed were unlike any chapter of my life I'd ever lived through. There was no dramatic music playing, no grand scenes of victory or redemption. Just quiet, steady work. Healing doesn't look like a movie. It looks like packing Lila's lunch in the morning and remembering to smile. It looks like showing up to therapy even when you're tired, and pushing through the discomfort of talking about things you'd rather forget. It looks like choosing peace over bitterness, even when the bitterness is justified. And it looks like reminding yourself, over and over again, that you are not who they said you were. I had spent so much of my life believing I had to earn love. From my parents, from partners, even from myself. I thought if I did everything right, if I was responsible enough, humble enough, accommodating enough, they'd finally see me. But their blindness wasn't my fault. It took nearly losing my daughter to understand that. I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided not to see it. My energy now belonged to Lila, to myself, and to the life we were rebuilding one piece at a time. Lila, too, was changing. The girl who used to shrink at the mention of her grandparents' names now asked questions with curiosity, not fear. "Why didn't they want me?" she once asked, while coloring a sun with bright orange rays. I sat beside her and said, "It's not about you, sweet girl. Sometimes people make selfish choices, and it has nothing to do with how wonderful you are." She tilted her head, thinking, "But you always choose me, right?" "Every single day," I said, "even when it's hard, especially then." Her smile was soft but sure. I held on to that moment like it was gold. We created new traditions. Sunday pancakes with strawberries, movie nights with matching pajamas, letters to each other tucked under pillows. She began to trust again, not just me, but the world around her. And through that, so did I. I didn't know how deeply I had been holding my breath until I started exhaling more often. One evening, we attended a local family night hosted by the same nonprofit that had once quietly cut ties with my father after the truth came out. I had been hesitant to show my face, unsure if people would judge me or if whispers would follow us through the room. But the opposite happened. A woman named Carla approached me, a social worker who had followed the story online. She didn't ask invasive questions or pity me. She simply said, "You gave people like me hope. We fight for families, but it's rare to see a mother fight back this hard." It reminded us why we do what we do. It hit me harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on survival that I hadn't realized what kind of ripple I'd created. That acknowledgement lit something in me. Maybe there was more to this story than just pain. Maybe the wounds could become a bridge for others to find their strength. That night, after Lila went to sleep, I pulled out my laptop and started writing. Not just journal entries, not just the story of what had happened. I began collecting the stories of other parents, people who had been failed by the system, betrayed by family, written off by those they trusted. I interviewed single mothers, immigrant fathers, foster kids who had aged out of the system. I listened. I cried. I learned. And then I wrote. My small website turned into a full platform. I named the new section Letters from the Edge, and each story was shared with consent, anonymously if requested. The inbox flooded weekly. Some messages were heartbreaking. Others were filled with strength I didn't know could exist in people who had been through so much. But all of them had one thing in common: a refusal to be silenced. The more I wrote, the more I healed. I poured into these stories the parts of me that still ached, and in return, I received pieces of wisdom, connection, and purpose. My pain had found a home, not in vengeance alone, but in transformation. Still, I hadn't forgotten what had been taken from us. Just because I chose to grow didn't mean I was done holding people accountable. I kept a folder on my desk, thick now with documentation, screenshots, and testimony. Not because I was planning a lawsuit, but because I believed in truth. And truth deserved to be preserved. Then, one day, an opportunity appeared without me asking for it. A local documentary filmmaker reached out after reading the series on the Unseen Wounds Project. She was working on a piece about betrayal within families, the kind that never makes headlines but destroys lives in slow, quiet ways. She asked if I would consider participating. At first I declined. The thought of putting my face on camera, of reliving every second in front of an audience, made me nauseous. But she was kind, patient. She asked me to meet for coffee and said, "Just listen." So I did. She showed me the other interviews. A man who was disowned after coming out. A woman whose mother exploited her credit to feed her gambling addiction. A brother whose younger sibling was abandoned after a car accident left him paralyzed. These weren't stories of villains in the shadows. These were tales of betrayal committed by the people who were supposed to protect you. I said yes. The filming took weeks. I sat in front of a simple black backdrop and told my story, piece by piece. I cried. I laughed in disbelief. I paused and breathed deeply when it became too much. But I told it all. Every raw, messy detail. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for the girl who once thought she wasn't enough. For the mother who had to fight to be believed. For every person still trapped in a prison built by their own blood. When the documentary aired 3 months later, the response was unlike anything I'd seen. Viewers from all over the country wrote in. Teachers, social workers, even estranged family members from other people's lives. The truth had power, and this time, it wasn't buried under shame. Lila watched the trailer with me, sitting cross-legged on the couch in her unicorn pajamas. She didn't understand everything yet. She was still young, but she knew enough. She looked at me and said, "You're really brave, Mommy." I kissed the top of her head. "You made me brave," I whispered. The greatest lesson I had learned through all of this was that strength doesn't come from rage. It doesn't come from revenge alone. It comes from choosing to keep going when it would be easier to stop. From holding your child's hand and promising them that no matter what comes next, they are loved, they are protected, and they are never, ever alone. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if my parents would ever try to crawl their way back into our lives. But I knew one thing for sure. They would never find the same woman waiting on the other side. 6 months had passed since the documentary aired, and for a while, it felt like the dust had finally settled. Lila was thriving, excelling in school, laughing more freely, trusting more deeply. I'd been invited to speak at several community events, not as a victim, but as a survivor, as a mother who stood her ground, as someone who refused to let generational harm pass quietly into another child's life. Every time I stood on a stage or sat across from someone who saw me not as broken, but as brave, a piece of the old shame dissolved into something stronger, something unshakable. But peace, I've learned, has a way of attracting disruption, and the people who fear being exposed never stay quiet for long. One Thursday afternoon, I received a letter, not anonymous this time, but carefully typed on legal letterhead. It was from my parents' attorney, stating that my libelous public statements had caused them emotional distress and reputational damage. The letter hinted at a lawsuit, demanding a retraction of all online material, an apology, and the immediate shutdown of my website. I stared at the letter for several minutes before setting it down on the counter. Lila was in the other room playing with her dolls. I didn't want her to hear the storm brewing again, but deep inside me, something clicked. They weren't trying to sue me because they were hurt. They were trying to silence me because they had lost control. This wasn't about reputation. This was about power, and their fear of losing it permanently. I called my attorney immediately. She was calm, experienced, and had been anticipating something like this ever since the documentary release. She reminded me that truth is not defamation, that we had documentation, that we had first-hand accounts, and most importantly, that we had the strength of public support. They can threaten you, she said, but they can't erase what happened. They're bluffing. And even if they weren't, we're ready. Still, the weight of the threat lingered in my chest for days. I found myself double-checking the locks at night, scanning unfamiliar cars parked near our building, walking Lila to school instead of letting her ride the bus. Trauma doesn't just fade. It adapts, reshaping your sense of safety, your routines, your breath. But every morning I woke up, pulled back the curtains, and dared the world to challenge me again. And then, the final straw came. One morning, I received an email from a parent at Lila's school. She was kind, gentle in her tone, but her words made my blood run cold. She said she had been volunteering at the school's front desk when a man matching my father's description came in asking for school directories. He claimed to be a concerned grandparent. He didn't say Lila's name, but he lingered by her classroom roster longer than any other. My hands shook as I closed the email. This was no longer a game. This wasn't about rumors or reputation. This was about control, about proximity, about intimidation dressed in a cardigan and a smile. I picked Lila up early that day. We walked home in silence, and I held her hand so tightly I feared I might never let go. That night, I filed for a restraining order. I documented every visit, every letter, every incident. My attorney helped me file an emergency petition, and 2 days later, a judge granted it. My parents were formally and legally prohibited from contacting Lila or me in any capacity, physical, digital, or through third parties. The order was specific, strict, and enforceable. Finally, there was a boundary they couldn't cross without consequence. But even with the legal wall in place, I couldn't rest. I kept thinking about what Lila had lost. Not just the grandparents she once loved, but her sense of stability, her understanding of trust. And I thought about the other children out there, the other parents afraid to speak up because their abusers were respected, because their pain was dismissed, because silence had been passed down like an inheritance. That's when I decided the story couldn't end here. I began writing a book, not a memoir, but a guide, part personal account, part survival manual for parents dealing with betrayal from within their own families. I wanted it to be a lifeline for anyone who didn't know where to start. I worked on it at night, after Lila had gone to sleep. I poured my heart into every page, including legal resources, mental health contacts, checklists for court, advice on talking to children, everything I had once searched for and found in bits and pieces. I wanted it all in one place, one voice, one torch in the dark. A publisher picked it up within 2 months of my proposal. The editor said it was urgent, fearless, and necessary. When the book was finally released, it debuted quietly, but word of mouth spread quickly. Local libraries requested copies. Bookstores invited me for readings. Parents wrote in saying, "This gave me the courage to leave," or I used your template in my court case. And slowly, the pain that had once felt like it would swallow me whole turned into something transformative. Not just for me, but for others. The book caught national attention after an interview I did on a podcast went viral. The host, a trauma survivor herself, said she had never heard someone speak about family betrayal with such clarity and grace. She ended the episode by saying, "You're not just telling your story, you're handing people a map out of the fire." I wept after that interview, not because of the compliment, but because I realized something that had been growing quietly inside me for months. I was no longer afraid of them. Not my father, not my mother, not their threats, their silence, their shadows. They had lost. They had lost the ability to make me question my reality. They had lost the right to my daughter's love. They had lost the narrative. And I had won. Not with rage, not with revenge served cold, but with fire forged in truth. Still, the ultimate confrontation was yet to come. It was at a school fundraiser, a public event held at a large local venue. I was invited to speak briefly about resilience and the importance of community support. I almost said no, but something in me felt ready. It was time. Lila was there, holding hands with her best friend, giggling near the juice stand. I stood behind the podium and looked out at a sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, but all watching. I spoke from my heart, told them not just what happened, but why it mattered. I told them about silence, about survival, about the strength we all have to rewrite our stories. And as I spoke, I saw them walk in. My parents. They stood near the back, stiff and pale, thinking they could intimidate me with their presence. I kept speaking. I didn't falter. And when I finished, the audience rose in applause. I stepped off the stage, took Lila's hand, and walked past them. They didn't say a word. They didn't dare. The moment I had once feared, facing them again in public, became my victory. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to demand they acknowledge what they'd done, because the world already knew. And more importantly, I knew. They could no longer touch us. The air felt lighter after that night. Not because anything external had changed drastically. My parents were still out there, somewhere in the same city, living in the ruins of the reputation they had once worked so hard to build. But because I no longer carried the weight of waiting for their next move. That moment at the fundraiser had marked a shift inside me. For years, I had lived in the shadow of their choices. I had flinched when the phone rang, braced myself for more guilt, more manipulation, more subtle attempts to make me feel like the unstable one. But now, they couldn't touch me. They had tried to ruin me quietly. I had responded publicly, and I had won. Lila was the mirror of that victory. Every day she smiled more, asked deeper questions, and moved through the world with a confidence that had once felt fragile. Her school counselor, who had been gently guiding her through this entire process, told me one afternoon during a check-in that she had drawn a picture of her safe home in art class. In it, there were just the two of us, a sunny kitchen, a garden with flowers and a big heart over our heads. No shadows, no extra people, just peace. She said she feels safe now, the counselor added softly. You've done something really remarkable here, Amelia. I wanted to cry, not out of sadness, but relief, because safety was never guaranteed. I had fought tooth and nail for it, sacrificed sleep, peace of mind, and every ounce of energy I had to give. And now my daughter could color it in crayon, hang it on a bulletin board, and carry it in her chest as a memory instead of a dream. That mattered more than any courtroom win or public praise. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a national conference for family advocacy and trauma recovery. The keynote speaker dropped out last minute due to illness, and they wanted to know if I would consider stepping in. The theme was breaking the cycle, and they said my story had already helped hundreds of people in their network. They wanted to give me a larger platform to share what survival looked like. Not polished, not dramatic, but real. I said yes. Preparing for that speech was unlike anything I had done before. This wasn't just a 10-minute community talk. It was a ballroom filled with therapists, advocates, survivors, educators. I didn't want to give them a speech full of cliches. I wanted to tell the truth, and I wanted to do it without hiding behind the protective armor I had learned to wear over the years. So I started with this. My name is Amelia Hart, and I used to believe that pain was something you carried quietly to protect the people who caused it. The room was silent, listening. I learned the hard way that silence doesn't protect anyone. It only prolongs harm, especially when that harm comes from the people we're taught to trust the most. And then I told them everything. I told them about the surgery, the call, the abandonment, the courtroom, the card in the cubby, the fundraiser. I told them about the way betrayal reshapes your nervous system, about how hard it is to explain to a child why love shouldn't come with conditions. I told them about building back a life from nothing. And I told them how I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come and started creating something better instead. When I finished, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was steady, long, and emotional. Some people stood, some people cried, and many came up to me afterward to say thank you. Not for the story, but for the validation. Because so many of them had lived pieces of what I described, but never had the space or the words to call it what it was. After that speech, I received an offer to consult for a new organization focused on preventing intergenerational trauma. They wanted to create resources for schools, clinics, and shelters, guides for how to spot the red flags in family systems that look healthy on the outside, but are fractured beneath the surface. They wanted me to help shape the narrative, write the material, speak at training events. It wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about becoming a resource. I accepted. My work at the clinic shifted into part-time hours so I could dedicate myself to the advocacy side full-time. Lila and I adjusted our routines. I brought her with me to a few age-appropriate workshops and family events. She was proud of me. I could see it in the way she told people, "My mommy helps other kids feel safe." I didn't correct her. It was the truth. In time, I found myself mentoring other mothers. Some had just gotten out of abusive households. Some had been gaslit for years by parents who manipulated them into silence. Some had children in foster care and were desperate to get them back. I didn't have all the answers, but I had been there, and I wasn't afraid to say it out loud. One woman, Maria, told me she hadn't seen her son in 8 months because her mother had filed a petition claiming she was an unfit mother, based on depression she had experienced after a miscarriage. She said I was too fragile to parent, Maria whispered during one of our sessions. I believed her, until I read your story. We built a plan. She fought. She won. One night, after putting Lila to bed, I sat on the couch holding a photo, not of the past, but of the present. It was from our trip to the botanical gardens that weekend. Lila was laughing in the sunlight, her hair wild and free, her cheeks pink from joy. I looked at her face and realized how far we'd come, how the child who once cried herself to sleep in a stranger's home now glowed with a light that came from safety, consistency, and love. And I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of their letters, their stares, their silence. I wasn't afraid of what people might say or who might judge me. I wasn't afraid of being alone, because I wasn't alone. I had built a village, a mission, a new legacy, not one rooted in fear or image, but in truth and connection. My parents never apologized, not once, not even after the restraining order, not after the documentary, not after the book, the speech, or the conference. And that's okay. I don't need their apology to know who I am. I don't need them to recognize my worth. I have a daughter who looks at me like I am her entire sky. I have a community that sees me, hears me, and walks beside me. I have a voice that no longer trembles. I once believed that vengeance would come in the form of destruction, of ruining reputations, of courtrooms and consequences. But I learned that real vengeance is living well, living honestly, living loudly. It's healing in public. It's refusing to go back into the box they built for you. It's holding your child's hand and walking straight into a future they never imagined you'd reach. I didn't just survive what they did. I built something beautiful from it. 3 years have passed since I last saw my parents. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Other times it's like I can still hear my mother's voice floating through a memory. coated in sugar and wrapped in manipulation. But even those echoes have begun to fade, replaced by new sounds. Lila laughing in the kitchen while trying to flip pancakes. The wind chimes on our balcony clinking softly in the early morning breeze. The low murmur of a support group sharing stories of survival and rebuilding. My life is no longer defined by what they did. It's defined by what we've created despite them. We live in a small 2-bedroom house now, tucked into a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors who wave when they water their plants. It's not fancy. The paint chips on the porch, and the faucet in the bathroom needs a second to stop dripping, but it's ours. Every piece of furniture has a memory. Every photo on the wall tells a story of a step taken toward peace. It's not the house I grew up in, and that's exactly the point. This house doesn't hold ghosts. It holds hope. Lila is 8 now. She's strong and sensitive, wildly imaginative, and fiercely protective of the people she loves. She still asks questions about the past sometimes, but they come with less pain now, more curiosity. "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa ever feel bad about what they did?" she asked one night while we sat on the living room floor folding laundry. I paused before answering. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But whether they do or not doesn't change who we are now. We're safe. We're happy. That's what matters." She nodded, then smiled a little. "I don't miss them. Is that okay?" I pulled her into my arms and kissed her forehead. "That's more than okay. You get to choose who belongs in your heart." I never imagined I'd be teaching my daughter emotional boundaries at such a young age. But then again, I never imagined I'd survive what we did, let alone thrive beyond it. She's learning early what took me decades to understand. Love should never come with fear. Family isn't defined by blood, but by behavior. And forgiveness doesn't always mean access. After everything that happened, I kept writing. It became part of my rhythm, journaling, blogging, contributing to collective anthologies of survival. Eventually, I began teaching workshops for other parents navigating the aftermath of betrayal. We called them Reclaiming the Narrative sessions. In each one, I asked people to write a letter they never intended to send. Some to parents, some to former partners, some to the versions of themselves that stayed too long or stayed too quiet. The letters were private, often burned afterward or locked away in drawers. But the act of writing them was always the beginning of something new. It was in one of those workshops that I met Marca, a retired teacher who had raised her grandson after her daughter disappeared into addiction. She shared her story with trembling hands, and when she finished, she looked at me and said, "I didn't realize how much I was still carrying until you gave me permission to set it down." That's what healing really is, I've come to understand. It's not a finish line. It's not a certificate or a public declaration. It's the quiet decision to set things down, to stop carrying what was never yours to hold in the first place. Guilt, shame, silence. You put it down and you walk away, one step at a time. One morning, Lila brought home a school project, a timeline of important moments in my life. There were photos of her first day of school, her favorite stuffed animal, our first vacation to the mountains. But what caught my breath was the final page. In big letters she had written, "The day Mommy and I made our own family." Underneath it was a drawing. Just the two of us, holding hands, standing in front of our house. No grandparents. No chaos, just us. I asked her, "Why did you choose that as your most important moment?" She shrugged with a smile. "Because that's when we started being happy all the time." Children don't remember every detail, but they remember how things felt. And if Lila remembered safety, happiness, and being chosen, then I had done my job. Sometime later, I received an invitation to speak at a university. The course was on trauma-informed care, and the professor had assigned my book as required reading. It was surreal, standing in front of rows of students, future therapists, social workers, counselors, sharing not just what happened, but what I learned through it all. I told them about systems that protect images instead of children, about institutions that fail people not because of malice, but because of indifference. And I told them what it took to rebuild, not just legally or logistically, but emotionally. During the Q&A, a student raised her hand and asked, Do you think people like your parents ever really change? I paused, looked down at my hands, and then met her gaze. Maybe, I said. People can change, but the question isn't whether they change. It's whether we're willing to let their change rewrite our pain. And for me, the answer is no. My story stays mine. Afterward, several students approached me, thanking me for my honesty. But one lingered a little longer. A young woman who looked barely 20, her eyes tired, her voice quiet. "Your story felt like mine," she said. "I didn't know anyone else went through something like that." We hugged. No words, just the understanding that comes from shared survival. Years ago, I would have crumbled under the weight of being someone's example. I would have felt unworthy, afraid I wasn't healed enough, smart enough, strong enough. But now, I knew the truth. You don't have to be perfectly healed to help someone. You just have to be honest and willing. I still get messages sometimes, from strangers, from mothers, from daughters, from people who are just starting to wake up to the fact that what happened to them wasn't love. I read each one carefully, and I try to respond when I can. I don't have advice, not always, but I can offer this. It's okay to walk away from people you once called home. It's okay to protect your child from grandparents who hurt more than they help. It's okay to write your own ending, even if it means burning the script they handed you at birth. One late autumn evening, Lila and I sat outside, wrapped in blankets, watching the sky turn to lavender and gold. She leaned against me and whispered, "We're not broken, are we?" I kissed the top of her head. "Not even close," I said. "We're the strongest kind of whole, the kind that grew back after being torn." She smiled, her eyes drifting toward the stars. "Then I'm glad it's just us." So am I. This is how our story ends. Not with courtrooms or ultimatums. Not with apologies that never came. Not with rage or destruction. It ends with peace. With quiet mornings and steady laughter. With bedtime stories and messy pancakes. With healing, one breath at a time. It ends with two people who survived everything they were never supposed to, and chose to build something beautiful in the ashes. Have you ever had to protect your child from someone you once trusted with your life? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. If this journey resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of courage, healing, and reclaiming your power. Share this video with someone who might need to be reminded that setting boundaries is not cruelty. It's self-respect. Thank you for being here. And always remember, the strength to start over can come from the very pain that tried to break you.